This true crime story tells the terrifying tale of a serial killer who hid in plain sight, fought off authorities, and avoided punishment, all while appearing to lead an ordinary life. Come with us as we explore the twisty life of Lynn Rader, the notorious BTK, who was both a loving family guy and a cold-blooded killer, and whose schizophrenic tales changed the course of criminal justice forever. Mystery and horror abound in BTK, the killer next door. Other unsettling names on that list were BTK, which stands for Bind, Torture, and Kill. In the 1970s, a violent madman started terrorizing the city of Wichita, Kansas. He managed to elude detection during the first inquiry, and in the 1980s and 1990s, he had transformed into a specter to the point where he murdered 3 further individuals, undetected by the authorities. Following this, he went underground, severed all ties of contact, and wiped out all possibility of his eventual identification. Well, nearly everyone does. He finally reached out again because he was desperate for attention. After just one slip-up, he was apprehended. It may have been 30 years after he began his murder rampage, but BTK was ultimately identified as Lynn Rader. Lynn Rader was born to William and Dorothea Rader on March 9, 1945. He was one of 4 sons. Although he spent his formative years in Wichita, he was really born in Pittsburgh, Kansas. It was in Wichita that he would later perpetrate his terror rampage. In 1964, Rader enrolled at Wichita State University after having attended Wichita Heights High School. However, he failed to enjoy college and, at the age of 21, enlisted in the United States Air Force to serve as a mechanic for 4 years. Rader planned to finish his degree when he got back to Kansas, but he ran into some problems. He earned a degree in Administration of Justice in 1979 after bouncing around between several schools. He worked as an assembly worker for a camping gear company, a grocery store employee, and an installation manager for a home security firm named ADT Security Services while he was living in Park City, Kansas, a suburb of Wichita. The third one happened while BTK was active and was actually a major factor in why a lot of people were purchasing home security systems. They let this stranger into their houses in the hopes of feeling safer, but little did they realize that he was precisely the person they had sought protection from. Carrie and Brian were born to Lynn Rader and Paula Dietz, whom he wed in 1971. Until decades later, on the outside, it appeared to be just another ordinary family life. Little did anybody know that something far darker was lurking beneath the surface. Theft of women's undergarments and peering through windows were Rader's hobbies. As he watched the pain and murder of animals, he started to feel sexually aroused. He began by observing the slaughter of chickens, but soon moved on to killing a dog and a cat himself. He took pleasure in both the act of spanking and the sight of other ladies undergoing the same treatment. He referred to such an act as Sparky Big Time, and the Big G was the moment of climax. Rader really had an entire lexicon, or codex, for his crimes. Many of the words he used were plagiarized from 1950s and 1960s real crime periodicals. He referred to his victims as projects and a murder as a hit. He invoked the Minotaur, the violent sexual monster residing within him, to describe his violent murdering tendencies. Going dark was his term for transforming from the regular family person he had always been to the Minotaur. Finally, he said that he was driven to kill by an enigmatic factor he called Factor X. 2 possibilities explain why he used all these phrases. Psychologists say he should try to put some mental space between himself and the consequences of his actions. He rationalized his actions by saying he was working on a secret project and not killing anyone, and if some supernatural force X was compelling him to do it, then it couldn't have been his fault. The second motivation was to boost his own sense of self-importance. As one would expect from a murderer with Rader's level of narcissism, he tried to establish a reputation for himself in the media, mock law enforcement, and project an air of mystique and intrigue to set himself apart from his criminal peers. The irony is that he was acting like a typical eager, manic psychopath by engaging in these behaviors to boost his own self-esteem. In pursuit of his S&M ambitions, Rader grew increasingly fearless over time. Upon leaving base, he destroyed the paper on which he had drawn his dreams while serving in the Air Force. He said he went to see prostitutes, but they were too scared to carry out his bondage fantasies. As an addition to his collection, he would occasionally break into houses and steal women's undergarments. This pattern persisted throughout his whole rampage. Throughout Wichita, Rader stashed several mementos from his victims in what he dubbed hidey holes. Of course, as time passed, drawings, and voyeurism weren't enough to satiate Rader's cravings. He would eventually get around to doing what he really intended, which was murder. The Otero family, husband and wife Joseph and Julie, as well as their 2 children, Joseph Jr., 9 years old, and Josephine, 11 years old, were the first victims of Rader's first assault on January 15, 1974. The family had a dog, so someone might have notified the neighbors, and he did it in the morning as the kids were getting ready for school. Put simply, this was a crime with a high level of danger, and Rader was fortunate that he was not apprehended immediately. The assassin claimed responsibility for waiting for his chance to strike in the Otero's separate garage. Joseph Jr. left the house for school just after 8:30 in the morning. At that point, Rader returned inside and threatened the whole family, brandishing a .22 caliber revolver and a knife. He assuaged their fears by informing the Oteros that they were the victims of a robbery and that they would be safe if they followed his instructions. And so the family did. After the father let the dog outside, they consented to being led into the bedroom and restrained. Their chance had passed, and they were now entirely at Rader's mercy, which was non-existent. This was the moment he had been dreaming of for decades. He used plastic bags or a piece of rope to strangle and suffocate the Oteros, just so he could strangle them again. He would sometimes let them catch their breath and regain awareness before he killed them. Although no one was sexually assaulted, the murderer's sperm was discovered at the site, which played a key role in the acquittal of the killer. To add extra chill to the crimes, 15-year-old Charlie Otero, one of the other children from the Otero family, was the one who discovered the bodies. Astonishment and dismay gripped the Wichita police. The grisliest killings they had ever witnessed occurred in broad daylight in a peaceful neighborhood. Further evidence that the murderer had meticulously prepared for the operation is the presence of tapes, hoods, wire cutters, cables, and, most likely, a firearm, everything necessary to incapacitate the entire family. Apart from the lost watch belonging to Joseph Otero, there was no indication of a robbery, forced entry, or struggle. The murderer even got into Otero's car and drove off once he was through. The police looked into the possibility that a criminal ring may have targeted the Oteros for death, because the circumstances surrounding the killings did not point to a serial killer. But when they investigated their histories, they came up with nothing that could explain why they would do anything like this. The presence of semen traces on the floor would not have indicated a professional hit. Wichita Police Chief Floyd Hanlon eventually told reporters that a serial murderer with a fetish was responsible for the attacks. Once again, the murderer struck only 3 months after that. The victim this time was Catherine Bright, a 21-year-old woman, on April 4, 1974. Rader waited for Bright to get home before breaking in while she was absent. An armed guy met the young woman and her younger brother, Kevin, at the door upon their return. Once again, Rader pretended to be a thief and promised his victims he would not hurt them if they handed him the cash and car keys. Kevin bound his sister to a chair while holding the intruder at gunpoint. They then proceeded to the bedroom, where the invader was similarly bound and gagged. But Kevin began to resist when Rader strangled him with a twisted stocking. Only then did he comprehend the seriousness of the situation. Quick thinking led Rader to draw a revolver from his belt and shoot Kevin Bright, ending the skirmish. Taking a little break, he came back to the room and shot him once again. He likely wasn't concerned about whether or not his victim was killed, as he was focused on his true objective, Catherine Bright. In reality, Kevin appeared to be in a fog and was still breathing. After he escaped, 2 passers-by rescued him, transported him to the emergency room, and then contacted the authorities. Authorities discovered Catherine Bright, who had sustained several injuries but was still alive upon their arrival. 3 knife wounds to the abdomen and ligature traces around her neck indicated that she had been strangled. She was taken to the hospital immediately, but she passed very shortly after. When the Otero family was killed, the authorities did not connect the murder of Catherine Bright with it. They were able to obtain a description of the killer from Kevin Bright, since Rader wasn't wearing a mask when he assaulted the brother and sister. However, this accomplished nothing. For some years after that, the killings ceased. First things first, Rader wanted attention, and he got it through his kills. Even after his crimes had faded from the news, he would periodically write to the press or the authorities to reawaken interest in them. In October 1974, 9 months following his murder of the Oteros, he made his initial effort at contact. Undercover Agent Rader called the Wichita Eagle and instructed them to peruse a certain book housed at the public library. In it, the The writer claimed responsibility for the Otero killings and painted the other police suspects as publicity seekers, among other things. There was no room for debate regarding the letter's legitimacy because it included previously undisclosed facts regarding the deaths. To avoid further fake confessions, however, the police requested that the publication not print it. Even though the Eagle did what was asked, the rival Wichita Sun managed to obtain a copy and published excerpts from the letter in December. A few relevant quotes that shed light on the killer's mindset are as follows. "I write this letter to you for the sake of the taxpayer, as well as your time. Those 3 men you have in custody are just trying to draw attention to the Otero murders. They were completely unaware of anything that was going on. I did it all by myself, and nobody helped. Society suffers the most because of this. It's hard to keep this monster from taking over my mind. I'll never understand it, but it's here to stay. How does one heal himself? If you mention that you've killed 4 people, they'll either laugh at you or panic or call the police. The monster keeps hunting me, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. People should be grateful that we have ways to escape, like daydreaming about torturing victims and making them feel my pain. Maybe you can stop the monster, but I can't. He has already picked his next victim or victims. I don't know who they are yet. I'll find out the identity of his next victim or victims the following day, but by then it will be too late. Good luck to you, my dearly guilty." Furthermore, the postscript stood out for its first ever mention of the killer's moniker. P.S. Since sex criminals do not change their MO, or by nature cannot do so, I will not change mine. The code word for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK. Look, he behaved once more. The next victim will be their target. The serial murderer was now known as BTK. You may have observed that the letter had several typos and grammatical mistakes. Reading it was a pleasure for me. However, it appears that the errors were made arbitrarily. Despite his apparent difficulty with more common, everyday words, BTK had no trouble spelling terms like psychotic or perversion. Early on, investigators concluded this was likely the criminal's attempt to appear less educated than he actually was. They also inferred from the letter's contents that he had a background in criminal psychology. It is strange that the letter did not name Catherine Bright, even though BTK obviously desired credit for his actions. This is just one more reason why the murder was unconnected until far later. Following 1974, BTK remained silent. At least for the time being, it appeared that the 5 killings and the letter had satisfied his insatiable need for attention. Not until 1977 did he launch another attack. He broke into the residence of Shirley Vian, 26, on March 17th and assaulted her. She was cooperating since she was there with her 3 children, and he had promised to leave them alone this time. He maintained his word. BTK did not hurt the kids, even though he confined them in the closet, at least in theory. Decades later, in an interview, Rader confessed that he had also planned to murder them, but he had to flee the scene. However, Shirley Vian experienced the brunt of his fury. After suffocating with a plastic bag and strangling with a string around her neck, the victim was discovered on the bed with her wrists and feet bound, according to the police. The cops had their suspicions about BTK's involvement from the beginning this time. There were many similarities between this murder scene and the one at the Oteros. It occurred during the day. It was obviously planned. The killer employed the same technique. The phone lines were severed, and the perpetrator even used the same characteristic knot for the cord, a fact that was left out of the media. Once again that year, BTK was the killer. On December 8th, the body of 25-year-old Nancy Fox was discovered in her house, strangled in her nylon stockings. On this occasion, however, BTK took a different approach. He reported his own murder to the authorities. We don't know why, but the murderer broke a window to enter the house, and it was nighttime when the crime was committed. Perhaps Rader just wanted to claim credit for it because it was different from the other crime sites. Back in the following year, BTK restarted his letter-writing campaign in the media, making his fixation with recognition very obvious. In January 1978, it all began with a paper that was delivered to a local TV station. His speech had become more coherent, precise, and error-free. How many more victims must I murder before my name is published or I am recognized on a national level? The Wichita Eagle-Beacon was the recipient of his second letter, which he mailed the following month. The poem he wrote there, "Oh Death to Nancy," was his first public statement on the enigmatic Factor X that motivated him to take his own life. Crucially, he said that he had killed 7 rather than 6 individuals, including Catherine Bright, though he refrained from naming her. For the subsequent 8 years, BTK remained inactive, with the exception of a near-death experience for a woman called Anna Williams, who likely had to consider herself the luckiest person in Wichita. On April 28, 1979, BTK had already chosen her as his next victim, but she had no idea. In order to await Williams's arrival, he broke into her residence. Nonetheless, she returned home somewhat later than BTK had expected due to a delay. He left before she came back, but he made sure to inform her of what had transpired because he was exhausted and frustrated from waiting. In a subsequent email, Rader returned one of her scarves while writing, "Be glad you weren't here because I was." In the early 1980s, the BTK case remained dormant. Rader not only restrained his violent tendencies, but he also ceased penning letters. On the side of the investigation, in 1979, police established a task group that first listed hundreds of potential suspects, but subsequently narrowed the list until no one remained. The group was dissolved after a couple of fruitless years of working together. As time went forward and no fresh information surfaced, BTK rapidly devolved into a cold case and detectives were reassigned. Somehow, word got out that BTK was no longer performing in Wichita. His profile said that he was likely dead, crippled, or incarcerated, and that as a compulsive psychopath, he would never voluntarily cease murdering. Surprisingly, none of those were accurate. Even while authorities sought him suspiciously, Rader continued his community service as a Cub Scout leader, compliance officer, and Christ Lutheran Church council member. Curiously, his sole interaction with the authorities in the 1980s was to deny being involved in the 1987 triple murder of the Fager family, although he did convey sympathy for the real murderer. This proved to the authorities, if nothing else, that BTK was alive and not behind bars. The authorities were mistaken about Rader's level of inactivity. The 3 more women he murdered were sufficiently dissimilar from his typical methods of operation that the authorities failed to link them to BTK. In 1985, one of Rader's neighbors, Maureen Hedge, who was 53 years old, was the first. Knowing how dangerous it was to go after someone so close by, he considered this his most audacious crime yet. Perhaps this is why he waited to take responsibility for the murder until after he had already been apprehended. Rader then brought her to his church to pose for pictures while holding her in various bondage positions after his strangulation of her. His next move was to dispose of her corpse in a ditch by an isolated dirt road. This occurred 8 years after the last murder, and it was the first time BTK attempted to conceal his crime. That the Wichita police didn't instantly link the crime to the city's notorious serial killer is not shocking. Once more, in 1986, Rader committed murder. On this occasion, he wrote a letter to the editor of the local paper claiming responsibility for the crime. A pair of pants were found strangled on Vicki Wegerle's body in her house. In addition to signing the letter with a smile, he included a photocopy of her driver's license as a token of his appreciation. For the following 2 years, BTK kept mum about their killing ways. However, in 1989, he wrote yet another letter to KQTV. An illustration and a poem on the killing of a senior woman were part of it. This time, the authorities were unable to link it to BTK. The authorities still failed to establish the link, even in 1991, when he abandoned a toy at the crime scene. This was a pivotal error that nearly cost BTK his entire career. The maker of the doll was located by the authorities, and they learned that a guy had bought many of them not long before. The police didn't consider Dennis Rader, who was named after the guy, to be a suspect since he didn't fit the description of BTK that they had developed. The BTK case became increasingly distant as the 1990s went on. As far as anybody could tell, neither letters nor killings continued. Although Rader's tactics shifted once again, he was still murdering. In 2004, following an extended absence, BTK made a triumphant return by providing police with a letter that detailed the 1985 murder of Maureen Hedge. The letter also included images of the crime site and a copy of Hedge's driver's license. In keeping with his other awards, he also included a BTK cereal box and a doll. According to this letter, BTK wanted to be featured in the media and even proposed the moniker, the BTK Strangler. The authorities, who had thought BTK had disappeared or was dead, were taken aback by his return. The fact that he divulged information about the 1985 murder that had been kept secret until then proved that the message was genuine. In the years that followed, BTK kept sending parcels, letters, and even a floppy disk with information that could be traced to a computer at Christ Lutheran Church in an effort to annoy the authorities and the media. So they ramped up their attempts to find BTK, whom they suspected would be a law enforcement insider, or at least know someone in the know. In 2004, BTK made his last blunder by sending a floppy disk to the authorities. Thanks to some metadata analysis, the cops found out that the disk had been used at a PC at Christ Lutheran Church. They eventually found Dennis Rader, the church council president. Thanks to this, Dennis Rader was apprehended on February 25, 2005. His comprehensive and terrifying confession implicated him in the BTK murders. After entering a guilty plea, Rader received 10 consecutive life sentences without parole for first-degree murder. The BTK case still hasn't been solved, and it's one of the most terrifying unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. It shows how difficult it is to find a serial murderer who can blend in with society. Dennis Rader, also known by his stage name BTK, spent years dodging law enforcement while appearing to be an upstanding citizen and family man. His story exemplifies how even the most innocent people may be capable of shocking acts of violence. Thank you very much for your attention. If you liked the video, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. If you have ideas for other exciting cases that you would like to see, please comment or send an email to crimesabroad@outlook.com.